All right. So a few things before we get going here. I want to mention. So basically, today's class and Thursdays are just like review. So I'll ask you guys for a lot of questions. We'll kind of want to make sure I work through what you guys have questions on. Before we get started, I put up a second practice final on Canvas this morning. So you'll kind of have another set of questions. Not quite as many as the first, but pretty close to having 30 questions, pretty close to a representative version of what you'll see on the final. CL sessions. So I will get those points updated this afternoon. I'll also re-update them tomorrow. I haven't checked with all the CL leaders that they got anything recorded from last night. I think that they have, based off what I can see in the shared file. But I'll make sure I re-upload them tomorrow just in case they're kind of missing some from last night, if there was a little bit of a lag in when they got those entered in. So you should now have an updated idea about what your points look like in every category, right? So that module reading score that you see has all the module readings with your lowest dropped, right? Those in-class participation quizzes, all of them in with your 4 lowest dropped. The weekly module quizzes, we now have all of them in and graded with the lowest drop. So if you couldn't see that last module quiz, I had the results hidden. I thought there was maybe some things going on where people maybe were helping each other after taking it once. So I didn't have those results set to be released until after the due date. So you should now be able to go back and review kind of what questions you got wrong, what the correct answer is for that final module quiz. So you should have that grade is up to date, dropping your lowest 2 module quizzes. The only thing that we don't have in yet is that final Canvas discussion. So once again, I said get on and get that done early. These should be easy points as long as you're putting in a good faith effort. Okay. There we go. Those should, your grade, you should be able to kind of calculate what your grade in that category would be. It's really just how many total points are you getting out of 100. Each discussion is worth 20 points. So, if you don't have it graded yet, but you've already submitted that Canvas discussion, you've already got that done, you should be able to figure out what your grade in that category would be. Hopefully, for most people, as long as you've done them, that should be pretty close to 100. All right, it should be 100. Okay. So you'll kind of have all these grades going into the final. That Canvas discussion, once again, even though it's not due until the end of this week on Friday, you should be able to kind of come up with what your own grade is in that category. If you need any help, feel free to kind of reach out. But it's basically just how many points out of 100 total do you have across the 5 assignments. And then you have your midterm exam grades. So what you can do and your collaborative learning points. Once again, just to revisit it, we have this Canvas hypothetical grade tool. You would just put what your grade is in each of these categories. Your CL points, you could then play around with different hypothetical grades on the final and what your kind of final score in the class or hypothetical final grade would be. Okay. It's calculated exactly how I'm going to calculate it at the end of the semester. Okay. Other than that, there will be, and I'll get an announcement posted, there will be some additional CL sessions. So one final kind of group of CL sessions this Thursday. There will be 2 available locations at each time slot. So not the usual 3. I'll get up later this afternoon exactly what those locations are. I've kind of confirmed with all the CL leaders that they will, in fact, be able to be there. And so I'll kind of have that list kind of ready to go, those times ready to send out to you guys. But there will be at least 2 locations at every time slot. So the kind of typical 3 time slots if you're kind of planning to attend one of those. There's nothing that they're going to have preset to go through. It's almost just like there will be someone there you can ask questions, right? So kind of like today, okay? Although if you don't ask me questions today, I'll probably do things they're not going to, right? They're only going to answer questions that you guys bring up to them, okay? Office hours will be the final office hours are tomorrow from 10 to 1. I will have the kind of Zoom popped up, but if it gets pretty busy, if you get on Zoom and there's 10 people waiting outside my office, I just kind of put you where you're at in terms of, where you signed on in terms of where you'd be at in the kind of line, right? So that'll be kind of the final office hours tomorrow. If you have questions, I will post this on Canvas as well. And I'll mention it again on Thursday. But we're going to be split between 2 rooms for the final exam, which is when? A week from today. It's not during normal class time. What time is it? Remember what I said? It's 5:20 to 7:20 p.m. Okay? I didn't choose this. That's what we were given by the university. We're going to be over in Hodge Hall, split between 2 rooms, which I'm going to put everyone with the last name A through L. You're going to be assigned to room 1055. So right there on the first floor. Right next to this is another room, 1059. Last names M through Z. Right? So those will be the 2 rooms where we start the exam. I likely will not be starting the exam with you. I'll be starting it with my other section, which is just up on the 2nd floor of Hodge. So once I get them kind of everything set with that section, I'll come down, make sure everything's kind of going. There'll be 3 TAs in each one of those rooms for our section. So there should be plenty of people to kind of hand things out. The earlier you get there, the kind of easier it is to kind of get things going. All you should have, just like the other exams, and they'll kind of reiterate this as well, you just need something to write with, a non-graphing calculator, and that's it. Okay? They'll hand out to you the exam. If you want extra blank paper, they'll have some. Once the exams are handed out, they can then hand out any blank paper, if people want some additional scratch paper to work on. Okay? Should be pretty similar, though, to the other 2 exams in terms of the just kind of format and logistics. Okay? There will be 30 questions, so a few more questions, but we've got 2 hours, so more time per question. There may or may not be a bonus question. I've already got it printed, so I probably know if there is a bonus question. Not telling you for sure, but look at my face. That's kind of everything that I wanted to mention prior to just doing review today. Once again, I'll get an announcement up with the information about the final. I'll reiterate it again on Thursday. Any logistical questions for me before we dive into material? Okay. All right. So let's take a look here. So I've got the practice final that I have already given to you pulled up. I'm assuming that's where people have questions. But if you have questions over old quiz questions, over old practice problems, we can pull those open as well. Any questions that people kind of had you want to start with here? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so module 13, we're looking at question 4 here. Okay, this one? Yeah. All right, it's a little bit small, so I'll kind of just say what it says. So they're telling you, you've got a monopolistically competitive firm. They're currently choosing a profit maximizing quantity of 10, and you're told their marginal revenue and marginal costs are both 20. They should be the same thing. That's how the firm makes the decision, right? They choose the quantity that maximizes profits, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But their average total cost is 55, average variable is 45, and then the price they're currently charging is 40. What are the value of profits? So I could draw this out. I don't necessarily have to. I'll give you a graphical representation in case you saw something like that in the exam, but you could also have a word problem that looks something like this, okay? So if we're drawing out a monopolistically competitive market, we're thinking about everything here. We're looking at this firm level, right? So the monopolistically competitive firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, just like every other firm. We have an increasing marginal cost. They're making decisions based off a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, similar to a monopolist. They have some monopoly power. So we were told in the problem, the quantity that they're choosing is 10. The value of their marginal revenue and marginal cost at that quantity is 20. They then would go up to the demand curve to set that price, which we're told is 40, okay? So the other pieces of information we were given are the values of average total and average variable cost. So this is where you wouldn't have to necessarily draw this out, right? So before I draw it, I'll go through how I would solve this without giving you the graphical depiction, okay? So typically, our profits are going to be the quantity we produce times the difference between price and average total cost, okay? So if I go ahead, well, here I was told the quantity is 10, the price is 40, and we were told the average total cost was what? 55, okay? So if I go ahead and compute this, I might think, okay, this is what? Negative 150 should be my profits, right? Why is that not the answer? Because that's my profits if I should stay open. My profits are negative here. So if my profits are negative, and the reason why they're negative is because what? Price is below average total cost. Anytime price is below average total cost, we know the profits will be negative, right? From this equation, right? If price is less than, that's a negative value. Quantities at the very lowest have to be 0, and we're told they're producing a positive amount, okay? So the next thing that we need to check is, do I shut down in the short run, right? So what is my kind of shutdown rule if price is below my average variable cost, okay? Now here I was told my price is 40, and average variable cost was told to me in the problem to be 45. So should I shut down? Yes, right? And in fact, if I shut down, we said our profit equation is a little bit different, right? If I shut down, what are my profits? Simply negative my fixed costs. Now, I wasn't given fixed costs, but in word problems like this, I said another way that we could kind of write fixed costs, it's my quantity times the average fixed cost, right? I wasn't given average fixed cost, but I know what is my average fixed cost. It's the difference between my average total and my average variable. I was given these. So hopefully if I go through and do the math, if I should shut down, what was the reason we were shutting down? Because when profits are negative, if I shut down, my losses are essentially smaller or a smaller negative value. So if I go ahead and compute this, hopefully my profits are less than, or sorry, I shouldn't say less than, hopefully they're greater than, or it's a smaller negative value than 150, right? So I'll go ahead, plug in my quantity, plug in my average total. My average variable is told to me in the problem to be 45. Sure enough, I get that if I shut down, my profits are negative 100. Losing $100 is better than losing 150. I mean, we're talking about firms, probably this is more like millions and thousands, hundreds of thousands, but here I'm trying to keep the numbers a little more simple, right? So this should be the value of my profits because price is below average variable cost, I should be shutting down, okay? So when you're working through these problems, if you're asked for the level of profits, you need to determine if they're positive or negative. If they're positive, why is that easier? Do I need to check the second condition? No, right? Of course I'm going to stay open. If they're negative, I have to check that second condition, which is, do they shut down in the short run and simply incur negative whatever their fixed costs are? Now, if I was drawing this on my graph, I would know that at this quantity, my average total cost was $55. So if I wasn't given to this into a word problem, I would look at that profit maximizing quantity and figure out what is the value of average total cost. And the problem, I was simply given that, right? I would also know, okay, average variable cost should be always below average total, right? Because the difference between those is my average fixed, so average total must always be something higher than my average variable because it includes my average variable and my average fixed. So here, visually, is my price below average total cost? Yes, so I know if I stayed open, profits would be negative. Is it below my average variable cost? Yes. So if I stay open, my profits or my losses would be this entire area. Whereas if I shut down, my losses would only be right here, 100 versus 150. Okay. Any questions? I'm adding things in here that are more than what you would necessarily just need to solve the problem, right? But this also, instead of giving you a word problem, I could give you a problem that asks a very similar thing, but give you a graphical depiction. This is true for any question, right? If you have a word problem, it could be using a graph. If you have a graph, you could be kind of translate that into a word problem, okay? Any questions over anything here? We're okay with that one? Now, just to kind of solidify some concepts, what do I know this firm is currently in? Short or long run? Short run, because fixed costs exist. In the long run, which of these curves would go away, essentially? Yeah, and they don't go away. That's not really the technical way. What happens in the long run? My average total costs simply become my average variable. So I would only have one line in there for both. Okay. Any other questions on this one before we keep moving? Now, if I was thinking about solving this one, I might, before I draw out anything, remember these rules. If price is above average total cost, profits must be positive, whether I stay open or shut down. So right away, if I look at this problem, I see prices below average total. What should I cross out right away? 0. I know my profits are going to be negative, right? Now from there, I can't cross anything else out. But if you did have distracting answers that were positive, you should cross those out right away as well, right? Now from there, we have to actually solve the problem to figure out which of these negative values is correct. But just a test-taking technique. Sometimes before you get too lost into the weeds of the equation and plugging things in, just remember, if price is above average total cost, I know that the profit has to be positive. If I know price is below average total cost, I know my profits will have to be negative. I can cross out some of those answers right away so that when I actually go to solve it, maybe if I had put up here another answer of positive 100, I forget that there's a negative sign there, but if I'd already crossed it out before I did all the work, oh, I remember I can't have positive profits here. It prevents me from making a very easy mistake, right? So when I go through and take these myself, like I literally will remember these concepts before I work with the numbers so that I don't forget to put negative signs and things like that in the exam, right? I just cross out those distracting answers, okay? Any other questions people want to see work through here? Yeah. On quiz? Yeah, so here we're kind of looking at excess capacity and markups, right? So this is where I've noticed some confusion. So when we're talking about excess capacity, it's a little bit different than when we're calculating deadweight loss, okay? Deadweight loss, we don't have a problem here. I'll kind of go through and show you how we would answer it. But excess capacity is always comparing the monopolistically competitive profit maximizing quantity to where we know the perfectly competitive market will end up in the long run, okay? So in the long run, where do we know perfectly competitive firms will always get driven down to? First of all, their profits will always be equal to 0. With a perfectly competitive market, they don't face this downward sloping demand curve. I don't have it drawn in here, but a perfectly competitive market faces a horizontal demand curve, right? Said differently, maybe this is a good thing to know if I ask a question. Perfectly competitive markets, if their demand curve is horizontal, that would be perfectly what? Elastic. Everyone's selling the exact same product. So as soon as I start to get any demand curve with a slope to it, that means it's a little bit more inelastic. Monopolistic competitive markets have some monopoly power. They have somewhat of a unique product. They're always going to face a slightly more inelastic demand curve or a sloped demand curve. Okay? So what point do we get driven to in the perfectly competitive market? Profits are 0, but we get driven down to that minimum point of the average total cost curve. Or what is another word that I sometimes would use to call that minimum point? Allocative efficient, or we said that would be like the efficient scale of production, kind of similar, 2 different words for the same thing or terms for the same thing. So we know that the perfectly competitive market will end up at that minimum point of the average total cost curve in the long run, okay? So that quantity that a perfectly competitive firm would choose in the long run is 28. What is this monopolistically competitive firm currently choosing? A quantity of 18. So relative, like our comparison, our baseline is if this was a perfectly competitive market, we know every firm should be producing 28. They're currently only producing where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue of 18. So our excess capacity, all excess capacity is that difference between that perfectly competitive quantity, which we know in the long run is going to get driven down to that minimum point of our average total cost curve, and whatever that quantity the monopolistically competitive firm is choosing. Okay? So for us here, that was 28 and 18, giving us that excess capacity of 10. Okay. Now, the second part of the question is, what is the markup, right? All the markup is the difference between the price that the firm is setting and the marginal cost. What would be the markup of a perfectly competitive firm? In the long run, if we end up at this point where we're at the minimum point of our average total cost, price would be equal to what in the long run for a perfectly competitive firm? We would just look at that point and say the price would be, remember horizontal demand curve, if it was perfectly competitive, a price of 50. What is the value of marginal cost at this quantity? 50. So what is the markup of a perfectly competitive firm? 0. We know that if we have any monopoly power, these firms can get away with not having a markup of 0. And if you think about it, price is really how much money I'm making by selling the good. Marginal cost is how much the last unit cost me. So that difference, this isn't quite right, but it represents something like, well, if I've made money off the price, it costs me my marginal cost. That difference is kind of like my marginal profits of the last unit. Do I want that to be positive or 0? Do I want my marginal profits to be 0 or positive? Positive. So I would like to have a markup. So here, if I'm a monopolistically competitive firm, my marginal cost at this profit maximizing quantity would be what? 10. What price do I set? I look at that quantity and I go up to the demand curve and know the last consumer was willing to pay. Did I follow this right? Hold on. Yeah, $60. So if the price they set is 60, their marginal cost at that quantity is 10, my markup would be the difference between the two, 60 minus 10 is 50. Okay. Everybody with me on that one before I kind of move on and kind of thinking about, I don't think I have a question maybe here. All right, I do, on 9, right? What if I wanted to calculate deadweight loss? So this is where I first introduced the idea when we were comparing long runs, but here, why do I know that this market is in the short run? Well, first of all, I have a difference between average total and average variable cost, but let's say I didn't give you the average variable cost curve. If the price they set is 60, what is their average total cost? 70. So the profits of the firm would be negative. What are profits of a monopolistically competitive market? In the long run, they're 0. Right? In fact, here, if I had negative profits moving towards the long run, what would firms do? Some firms would exit the market. The remaining firms would see what change. Well, the overall demand for the product hasn't changed, but if there's fewer firms, the remaining firms get a larger portion of the overall market demand or a larger piece of the pie, so they would see a demand increase until profits are equal to 0. Okay? Now, if we were in the short run, what is our deadweight loss? So this is where it's a little bit different, right? When we're calculating deadweight loss, we're not comparing to that long run minimum point of the average total cost curve. We're simply comparing to if a perfectly competitive firm did face this downward sloping demand curve, which we know they don't, right? They face a horizontal demand curve. But if they did, and they were acting not like a monopolistically competitive firm, but acting like a perfectly competitive firm, where do perfectly competitive firms set the price and quantity? Not where a twice as steep marginal revenue curve is equal to marginal cost, but we simply end up where supply is equal to demand. Okay? So what in this graph would represent the demand curve of the firm? Well, we've got the demand curve. What would represent the supply curve of the firm? Marginal cost. So if this was a perfectly competitive firm, instead of choosing this quantity of 10, what would they choose? Where marginal cost, the supply curve, is equal to demand, they'd be out here at 26, right? So what would total surplus be? The area below demand, but above this marginal cost curve. Now, I didn't ask you to calculate that because we don't have I kind of had like a, marginal cost curve where it's not linear, so it'd be more difficult to calculate total surplus. All I'm asking you to calculate here is based off of the linear portion of the marginal cost curve. We know that this would be the perfectly competitive point. But we have a monopolistically competitive firm. They're choosing a quantity down here, setting the price up here. So what are we losing? Every unit between what? 18 and 26, we're losing that difference between our supply and demand curves. Okay? So when we're thinking about calculating deadweight loss, and here on the exam, give you things that are very clearly linear. I would never ask you to calculate and haven't asked you to calculate anything that's not linear. So if I've got a marginal cost curve, I've got my demand curve. We said this represented the supply of the firm. Here was the demand curve the firm faced, twice as steep marginal revenue. Here's the quantity that the perfectly competitive firm would have chosen. Here's the quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm chose. So what happened, because this was a monopolistically competitive market relative to a perfectly competitive market, where when we have a perfectly competitive market, total surplus is maximized. It's at its highest possible value, right? We've got perfect competition. If we've got not perfect competition, some firms have some monopoly power, they restrict quantity, right? Set a higher price. So every unit here, what surplus are we missing out on? Total surplus in the market. Anytime we're talking about surplus, it's the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. For the market, though, what represents our marginal benefits? The demand curve, marginal cost, sorry, not F, the supply curve of the firm in this example. So the difference between our supply curve and our demand curve, for all of those units that the monopolistically competitive firm is not producing, this would represent our deadweight loss, right? So this is going to be the area of a triangle. Hopefully we're okay kind of calculating that. If we look here, that goes what? The height goes from 60 to 10. So notice, what was the height of that triangle always going to represent? If it's the difference between price and marginal cost, that height would always be our markup. And then we'll look at all those units that they aren't producing because they're acting like a monopolistically competitive firm. So we go from 18 to 26. So 8 times what? 50 is 400 times 1/2 gives us that deadweight loss of 200. So don't forget that 1/2, right? When we're calculating deadweight loss, every model we looked at, it's the area of a triangle. So never forget to multiply by 1/2, okay? So I think what you're asking is this. We'll see if I'm right. So if this was the long run for a monopolistically competitive firm, you know that your average total cost, I'm a little bit off my drawing here, but it hits marginal cost at its minimum point. But at this price, if I'm in the long run, what has to be true? Well, if my profit equation is price minus average total cost, if I'm producing anything, what's the only way profits are equal to 0? Price would have to be equal to average total cost in the long run. Yep. So that's why in this case, it wasn't the same, which is why we knew we're in the short run, right? We don't have profits of 0.
Like, could you explain that for like number 1 and number 8?
What?
I feel like it's not like any point on the average total cost for long run.
So
Number 1.
So in the long run, what's going to be true here? Well, first of all, in the long run, we know profits are equal to 0. So what has to be true? Price is equal to average total cost. If I'm profit maximizing in any market, how do I make the decision to profit maximize? It's the quantity where, once again, this should be burnt. If you've got to know this going in. This is true for every single market. Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So if a monopoly or a monopolistically competitive firm chooses the price by going up to, this is why I explain it in the way that they choose the price, they go up to the demand curve to set price, what will always be true about price relative to marginal cost and marginal revenue? Price will always be above both of those, right? Because I'm setting the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue and then going up to the demand curve to set the price. So the price will always be above marginal revenue and marginal costs. Okay? And in the long run, for a monopolistically competitive market, will that price be equal to the minimum point of the average total cost curve? No. The only way we get to that minimum point of the average total cost curve would be if I had a perfectly competitive market, because in a perfectly competitive market, we've got our average total cost curve. We've got marginal cost hits it at its minimum point. If I was here, let's say this was the current price, this would be the marginal revenue that a perfectly competitive firm faces. Well, what's true about where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue? Price is below average total cost, right? So if price was below average total cost, so this is kind of everything at the firm level for a perfectly competitive firm. What happens at the market level? So where does this really low price come from? It comes from the market. So if profits are negative, price is below average total cost, what will firms do? Exit. With our perfectly competitive market, here's where it operates slightly different than a monopolistically competitive market. In a monopolistically competitive market, when firms exited, the demand that each firm faced went up. In a perfectly competitive market, what is their demand curve? It's the price. As firms exit, what happens to market supply? If there's fewer firms, market supply is going to decrease, which does what to the price? Increases it. So firms exit until that market price, which is the firm's marginal revenue, is driven up to this point where now where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue is at a price that's exactly equal to average total cost and is right at its minimum. So in a perfectly competitive market, if I was asked the same question, what is true? Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, which is also equal to the price, which is also equal to average total cost, which happens to be the minimum point of average total cost as well, right? So these are kind of some differences that we see between a perfectly competitive market and the original questions we were going through, which was a monopolistically competitive market. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so if we're talking about differences between the market and the firm, if this was, so first of all, before I answer this, any questions over what I just did before we kind of go one, because this is a slightly different topic question. Yeah, so if I were to ask you a question here, and this is where pay attention to the question, and I usually will bold this if it's asked about the firm level or the market level. What happened to the quantity in the market? As firms exited, the quantity in the market actually went down, right? What happened to the quantity at the firm level, right? The firm faces this horizontal demand curve in a perfectly competitive market, but the overall demand for the product is still a downward sloping demand curve, right? The market demand curve is still downward sloping. So in the market, quantity went down, price went up, but for the firm, what happened to our quantity? At the firm level, each remaining firm is actually producing more, right? And, this kind of makes sense as firms exit. Yes, some of the existing firms will pick up the slack, right? Be able to sell some of the units that they previously were. But the fact that there are lower numbers of firms increases that price, which results in consumers being willing to buy less than before. So even though each firm is selling more units, we have fewer firms, which results in, how do I find market quantity? I would take the quantity of each firm, multiply it by the number of firms. We see that the overall market quantity is going to go down as those firms exit. The firms that remain will sell higher quantities, right? But the overall market quantity is going to go down. Okay? Yeah. Any other questions on this one before we move on here? Okay. You said 17 on the practice exam? Yeah, so I can almost guarantee you'll see questions that look just like this. So This was kind of our game theory module where we're thinking about, we have a duopoly market, which means we have two firms, right? I mean, you've got to be able to answer questions like this. They showed up on the practice problems, the quiz, the practice exam for the final. What do you think probably is going to be true? Probably end up on the final as well, right? So if I had a duopoly model, and the first one here, and they might not always be in the same order, so read the question carefully. If we hold true to the collusion agreement, so we've got two firms working together to act like a monopolist, right? So what is going to be true? Well, if we think about the quantity that the firm faces and market quantity, if we have a monopolist, demand for the market is the same as demand for the firm. One firm faces the entirety of the demand curve, right? So if a monopolist was making this decision, they're going to make this decision based off of where twice as steep marginal revenue curve hits marginal cost. So the first step, right, is we're going to set quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost and act together like a monopolist. Okay? So if I'm looking here at my problem, I wasn't given marginal revenue. All right? However, oh, come on. How could I calculate my marginal revenue? So marginal revenue is the what? Change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. Anytime we looked at a marginal anything, what was always in the denominator? A change in quantity. All right, so that's maybe something to remember. Anytime you're looking at marginal costs, marginal revenues, it's a change in whatever you want to find marginal of. So marginal revenue was the change in revenue divided by a change in quantity. Marginal cost, change in total cost divided by change in quantity. So here, my revenue goes up by 9,500. My changes in quantity are kind of nice, always 100 here. So I basically am going through finding the change in revenue, dividing it by 100. So here I've got what? 95, 85, and I'm usually pretty friendly in these examples. If I go through and calculate the marginal revenue here, because I've got linear demand curves, it's always going to be kind of decreasing twice as steep. What was the slope of my demand curve? Well, my demand curve is represented by what? Price and quantity. So instead of like getting too lost in numbers, here's another easy way of doing this. When quantity went up by 100, how much was the price falling by? So every time quantity goes up by 100, how much would marginal revenue fall by? Twice as steep, so it would go down by 10. What's happening to my marginal revenue? It's always going down by 10, right? It's a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, okay? So if I'm making the decision here, if I have a constant marginal cost, so this is where I drew it out with an upward sloping marginal cost because we could answer other questions that way. In these types of problems, I give you a constant marginal cost to make it easier, right? So with my constant marginal cost of 60, is the marginal revenue of the first 100 units greater than that marginal cost? So is 95 greater than 60? Yes, so I produce 100 units. Is the marginal revenue of 85 greater than 60? Yes, so I produce the 200. Yes, yes, no, right? 55 is not greater than 60, so I don't produce 500. If we work together and act like a monopolist, we'll set the quantity at 400, okay? Now, how would I find the price that we set? Well, it's just the price that's associated with, or where I'd be at on the demand curve at 400, so that would be at a price of 80, right? So I'm thinking about here, and I had a constant marginal cost, but the same thing would apply. We just found a quantity of 400, and the price associated with that quantity, or the point I'd be at on the demand curve, was a price of 80. Now, here's where I have to remember in these duopoly market models, we're acting together to restrict quantity. So where would the perfectly competitive market end up at? Well, if I have one firm, their marginal cost would be all of supply. So where would a perfectly competitive firm end up at? Where supply is equal to demand. So we know that if they work together like a monopolist, quantity will always be lower. Now, if I have two firms and we're agreeing to put 400 units on the market, each of us is going to produce half that, right? So when we have these duopoly models, each firm would produce 200 units and set a price of 80. Okay, so here each firm is going to produce 200 and set a price of 80. Okay, so this is a unique example. You might see something like this on the exam. There is no one point where marginal cost was exactly equal to marginal revenue. So that's the rule that we use. Technically, we say we produce as long as marginal revenue is greater than or equal to. So we continue to increase our quantity until we get to the point where the last unit we can see in our table is greater than or equal to. There was no equal point here, right? So we stopped at the last unit where it was greater than or equal to. If I had a different example where I had a marginal revenue value, let's say this was 60, then I would have stopped at that quantity of 500, right? I'll go up to the point where it's greater than or equal to. In this case, we didn't have an equal point, so we stopped at the last one where marginal revenue was greater than marginal costs. Okay? Now I forget who asked that question. But that's how I would go through that one, right? Now, if I was really confident in my answer to this question, right? The next question is, what if they break the agreement, right? As soon as I know they break the agreement to work like a monopolist, what should happen to the quantity in the market if they then instead act more like a perfectly competitive firm? Quantity should go up. So if I was confident in my answer in 17, right away, what could I cross out in question 18? A, right? If they were producing 200 units before, I know when they break the agreement, they're going to have to both be producing more than that, right? Now, from there, I'm going to have to actually figure out, is it 400 or 800, right? Well, how would I identify where the perfectly competitive point is from this table? I know it's where that supply is equal to demand for the perfectly competitive firms, or where marginal cost is equal to demand. But what represents my demand curve? The combination of price and quantities. So is that point I'm at in the demand curve above that marginal cost of 60 at 0? Yes. At 100? Yes. At 200? Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, it's equal at this point, so we know they'll go up to that point. Would we see 900 produced in the market? No, right? Because that demand curve is now below that constant marginal cost or supply curve of 60. So the market would stop at 800. Once again, we have a duopoly model. So if the total quantity in the market is 800, each firm is producing half of that. Or 800 over 2 would be 400. And if it's a perfectly competitive firm with a constant marginal cost, what'll always end up being true about the price? It's going to be equal to that marginal cost, right? So we end up at that total quantity in the market of 800. The price is 60. Each firm is producing half of that because we have a duopoly model. So it would be what? 460, which makes sense, right? We know that a monopolist should choose a lower quantity and set a higher price. So the monopolist was choosing to produce 200 units and charging a price of 80. Okay. So once again, I could have also said, if I was confident in my answer in 17, when they break the agreement and don't act like a monopolist, what should happen to price? It should always go down. So it should have been less than 80. I should have been able to cross out A and B right away, right? So just once again, you can start to think about, like, even if I had to then guess, at least I'm guessing between two options as opposed to four, right? So this is, just test-taking techniques of trying to limit using the concepts that, so maybe sometimes you can rule out certain answers. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Yeah, go here and here. Hmm? No, what is demand, right? Demand is simply all the combinations of price and quantity. So if I'm looking for the point where marginal cost is equal to my demand curve, it's just at what quantity is my marginal cost the same as price, right? So at what quantity was marginal cost of 60 equal to the price at a quantity of 800 for the market? Yep. Before I move on to your question, I just wanted to maybe point something out. So also when I'm adding things in here, there's probably a reason, right? So if I had a question like this, and maybe it wasn't associated with the duopoly model, but maybe it was just associated with a monopolist, okay? So if I was at that monopoly quantity and price, so that was what? We said 480. What's true about my marginal revenue? Is it positive or negative? Positive. So I know what portion of the demand curve am I on. If marginal revenue is positive, we said that must mean that demand is elastic. Let's say I ended up at that perfectly competitive point. Well, this is an example where even at the perfectly competitive point, marginal revenue is positive. So my demand curve, what portion am I on? Elastic. It's still positive on the elastic portion. Now, what can happen if I have different values here is maybe if my marginal cost was lower, so let's say down here, they break the agreement and marginal cost is 40, right? Or if I think about who else acts like a perfectly competitive market but is a monopolist? Someone who can perfectly price discriminate. So maybe another question could be, if the marginal cost was constant at 40, if we had a perfectly competitive market, or I have a monopolist who can perfectly price discriminate, now where does the quantity go to? Well, now where does marginal cost equal my demand curve all the way down here at this quantity of 1200? What is now true about my marginal revenue curve? It is negative. So in this case, they would end up on the demand curve, the portion of the demand curve that is inelastic, right? So knowing this relationship, if marginal revenue is positive, I'm on the elastic portion of my demand curve. If it's negative, I'm on the inelastic. And I guess there is one more. If it's 0, I would say that I'm at what point of the demand curve? Unit elastic. That might be a good relationship to know, okay? You might see that pop up on some of the other questions, but just making sure I reiterate that. Okay, any questions on anything I just said there before we move on to something new? Okay. And then I think you had a question on the next one. I saw your hand. Yeah. Yeah, so I would only ever ask you. So would you have a question in mind? It might be easier to do it that way. All right, so 30. Oh, okay. So here, I was going to say, I will only ever ask you to make 2 comparisons. So this might be worthwhile, right? So in question 30, we'll do that one first, just because where are we at in time? Okay. I would ask you to compare surpluses of monopolistically competitive to perfectly competitive markets. I might also ask you to compare surplus values of monopolies to perfectly competitive. I would never ask you about surplus values other than total surplus to compare a monopolist to a monopolistically competitive. So we'll think through this one because it asks about consumer and producer surplus here. So let's say I had a monopolistically competitive firm. We're thinking about things at the firm level. We've got a downward sloping demand curve that the firm faces. We have an upward sloping marginal cost, or we can think about this as like the supply curve of the firm. And they're making a decision based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So here, where would the monopolistically competitive firm choose the quantity? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We then go up to the demand curve to then set the price, okay? So if I think about here, I want to leave myself some space down here. What is consumer surplus for this monopolistically competitive firm? Anytime we're thinking about surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost to that group. So for a consumer, what is the marginal benefit represented by? Demand curves, right? What is the marginal cost to a consumer? The price they pay, right? So if I'm thinking about here, what is consumer surplus? It's the area between demand and price up to the quantity that is sold in the market, right? So here's like my consumer surplus of this monopolistically competitive market. What is producer surplus? Once again, differences between marginal benefits and marginal costs. What is the marginal benefit to producers? When I sell something, the marginal benefit is the price. What is the marginal cost to me? It's my marginal cost curve, right? Or my firm supply curve. So for the producers, the difference between the price and that supply or that marginal cost curve, this would be my producer surplus. Now, I'm going to draw in separate graphs, hopefully to make this a little bit easier. But if this was a perfectly competitive market, okay, good. I'm going to try to draw these exactly the same. Might be a little bit off here. Where would the perfectly competitive market choose? Simply where firm would, where would the perfectly competitive firm choose? Sorry. Simply where supply is equal to demand. So in that case, right, here would be the perfectly competitive price. Oh, sorry. PC, right? Perfectly competitive price and quantity. What would consumer surplus be here? It's still the difference between demand and price, but the price is now down here and the quantity is higher. So it's the difference between the demand curve and the price up to that last quantity sold in the market, which is now higher than a monopolistically competitive firm. So what happened to consumer surplus if this was a perfectly competitive market? Consumer surplus went up. What happened to producer surplus? Well, producer surplus is still the difference between the price that is set in the market and the supply curve or the marginal cost curve. So producers lost this rectangle and they only gained this small triangle. So in general, right, if we're comparing that consumer surplus of a monopolistically competitive to a perfectly competitive firm, it's lower. But for producers, and this is where the intuition goes a long way, when I lose a triangle relative to a rectangle, because these are linear demand curves, well, what do I not do when I calculate the area of a rectangle? I don't multiply it by 1/2, right? So I'm not going to ask you to calculate the actual values, but an easier rule to kind of remember is if I lose a rectangle and gain this small triangle, generally my loss is going to be greater than my gain, right? So typically with these monopolistically competitive markets, their producer surplus, they've lost a large amount, gained a small triangle, it's likely going to be, or in our models where demand is simply linear, it will always be greater. And this is intuitive. When I have some monopoly power, who is that a good thing for? Producers. Their surplus will be higher than if they didn't have any. Who is it a bad thing for? Consumers, right? They're going to end up paying higher prices, and we're going to see fewer consumers be able to purchase this good, okay? So that's kind of 30, right? That's comparing those surplus values. Now, I didn't add in here, I think one of the options might have been something about total surplus. Well, if we're missing out on all of this, we're going to have what? Some deadweight loss. So what is true about total surplus for a monopolistically competitive market? Well, if we have some deadweight loss, total surplus must be lower than a perfectly, because what is deadweight loss in a perfectly competitive market? 0. That was our baseline. That was where total surplus was maximized. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Now, I won't draw it out just for the sake of time. If I wanted to compare a monopolist to a perfectly competitive market, if I were to draw it out, everything here would look exactly the same, right? Now, my demand curve might be more inelastic, right? Because I have just one firm selling the product. But in terms of the directional changes, all the same things would apply, okay? Any other questions on this one before we keep moving? Yeah, so you're right. I should preface what I just said is if we were comparing a single price monopolist to a perfectly competitive market. If I can perfectly price discriminate, and we'll kind of think about this as like my comparison, perfectly competitive. If a monopolist could perfectly price discriminate, even if I gave you a depiction with a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, how would a perfectly price, what's the marginal revenue curve? So this is if they're setting a single price. What's the marginal revenue curve of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist? It simply becomes the demand curve, because I can charge every consumer exactly what their marginal benefit is. So where would marginal revenue be equal to marginal cost if I can perfectly price discriminate? It ends up being at the perfectly competitive quantity. So here, if I can price discriminate, I end up setting the same quantity as a perfectly competitive market would. So what has happened to dead weight loss? If I'm at that allocated efficient or the efficient scale of production, total surplus is maximized dead weight loss would be equal to 0. So if I can perfectly price discriminate, dead weight loss goes to 0. But what is my producer surplus if I can price discriminate? Once again, what are the marginal benefits and marginal costs to the producer? Marginal cost is represented by their marginal cost curve. The marginal benefit is the price they set, but they're setting different prices. It's no longer a single price, right? So their marginal benefit or their marginal revenue, the price they're setting, simply becomes the demand curve. The difference between supply or that marginal cost and demand curve, all of surplus becomes producer surplus if I can price discriminate. What is the value of consumer surplus? Well, if consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs, well, what's the cost to a consumer? How much they have to pay for the good or the price? But we said, what price am I setting if I can perfectly price discriminate? Exactly the consumer's marginal benefit. So what does consumer surplus go to if we can perfectly price discriminate? The price is exactly equal to their marginal benefit. So consumer surplus is technically here. But what's the difference between price and marginal benefit at every point? 0. So we end up with consumer surplus, if I can perfectly price discriminate, is 0, which is much lower than before. So producer surplus would still increase with a price discriminating monopolist, but it'll increase even more. Our dead weight loss will no longer exist. We get to that maximized total surplus, but it's at a cost, right? In the sense of our consumer surplus goes to 0. And if you're trying to connect this to a problem, I'm guessing there was one back in the monopoly portion. So number 12 would kind of be related more to this perfect price discrimination in terms of the directional changes we see with total consumer and producer surplus. Okay. Is that okay? Yeah. So practice problems 13. Question. Yeah, so we can work through this one. This would be a good one to know how to do. So we've got spending on advertising, right, is going to have 2 impacts. Okay. So they're spending a large amount of money, a fixed cost, right, on advertising is what you're told. And assume here that the individual demand curve of the firm stays the slope stays the same, but they're able to increase kind of the portion of market demand, right? Their own firm demand curve is now going to be higher, okay? So we have 2 things happening. I would draw them on separate graphs. This is kind of like where you can draw a simultaneous supply and demand shift, but sometimes the answer is indeterminate, so it's easier maybe to put them on separate graphs. So for the first thing, let's think about if I had a monopolist or monopolistically competitive, probably more likely, I don't have any competition, I don't need to advertise. So monopolistically competitive market. And let's assume we start out at a point just to make this a little bit easier. So here's my original average total cost curve. I'd set the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I then go up to the demand curve to set the price. Here, though, I try to draw what's true about price and average total cost. They're the exact same values. So initially, my profits are 0, right? If I can gain a higher portion of the overall demand curve, my demand curve is going to shift to the right. Right? So let's just draw this pretty extreme. Well, if my demand curve shifts, what also shifts? Well, if marginal revenue is twice as steep as demand, but they start at the same point, I'm also going to see my marginal revenue curve increase as well. So where is the new point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue? Looks like it's out here. So with this increase in demand, the firm produces a higher quantity. When they go up to the demand curve, the new demand curve after it increased, what is going to be true about the price they can set? Price also goes up. Now, what is true about the difference between price and average total cost? That difference exists, right? So if price is above average total cost now, then what's true about profits? They started out as 0. They are now positive. Profits must have went up. And they could have started out as positive. They're just going to be now a larger positive value. I'm just using a 0 point to kind of make it easier to see that we know for sure when I have a demand increase for my product, profits will be higher. Okay. Now we're not done because that's only half of it, right? The other half is going to be when I spend money on advertising, right? I've got this demand curve. I've got this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Here's my marginal cost. Let's assume, once again, just to make it maybe a little bit easier to see, let's assume we started out from a point where profits were 0, right? So we've got the quantity the firm chooses, the price they set, price is exactly equal to average total cost, so profits start as 0. This is the whole reason why I was advertising, right? I was at 0 profits, I want positive profits. I know if I advertise, maybe I can shift my demand curve. But that comes at a cost, right? So if I spend money on advertising, right, we said the way I set up in class, and also this problem kind of mentions, it's only changing my fixed cost. When I spend money on advertising, if I sell 1,000 units or 1,000,000 units, the billboard costed me the same amount of money. It's independent of my production, so it's not a variable cost. So my marginal cost will stay the same. All I've done is increase my average total costs. Okay? So now, what is true about the profit maximizing price and quantity? If I'm just looking at the effects of the increase in fixed cost, no change, right? But at this point, what is now true about my price relative to average total cost? Price is now below my new average total cost. So now profits are going to be price is below average total cost. Profits are negative. What's happened to profits? They went down. So there was no change in terms of that cost, the fixed cost. It didn't change quantity. It didn't change my price, but it pushed my profits down. So if I'm thinking about what is the total effect of spending money on advertising, even if it's effective, even if it increases my demand curve? Well, I know for sure if both of these things happen at the same time, I spent money on advertising, and as a result, I get a higher portion of the overall market demand. I know the total effect would be that the quantity I sell, so if I think about like my total effect here, I'm going to sell more units. I'm going to increase the price, but what's going to happen to profits? I don't know. Depends on how much I was able to shift my demand curve relative to how much money I spent, right? So when it comes to advertising, we said the change in profits is always going to be indeterminate. We can't say or cannot determine, okay? So if we're thinking about I think the question here, which of the following must be true? Well, we know the price will be higher. We knew the quantity will be higher, so B's not right. The markup we didn't talk about. I'll come back to that. We said profits are indeterminate, so these two aren't true. A is true. Why do we know the markup, this one can't be true? So if it doesn't decrease, why do we know the markup will always increase? Right? So you can kind of see here, the markup is getting like a little bit bigger. But maybe if I was trying to depict this just on its own, we said, if I have a demand curve and I have a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, what did the increase in demand do to my quantity? It made the firm produce more. So if I think about the same marginal revenue and demand curve, if I look at this quantity, the difference between my marginal revenue and my demand curve, which ends up being the price, and if I had, let's just do an easy one where I say maybe think about a constant marginal cost. This is my markup, right? The difference between price and price and marginal cost. If I'm looking at a higher quantity, so let's say I just even think about all the way, well, I need an actual point. So let's say I go all the way out here, right? What is going to be happening to, well, no, I don't, this isn't what I wanted, but no, hold on. I can't use a constant marginal cost here to make this easier. So I need to show you actually what's happening to the markup. So we've got to do the constant or the increasing marginal cost. But it's a similar idea. So if I think about them at a lower quantity, what's true about that difference between price and marginal cost? This would be like my initial markup. If I'm looking at higher quantities, which we know advertising will result in higher quantities, what's happening to that gap in between kind of price and kind of what the marginal revenue of the firm is, that gap is going to be getting larger, right? And here it would get more complicated because I'm actually shifting demand, but I'm just trying to get at the idea that because I produce a higher quantity, I know that gap in between marginal revenue, the point where marginal cost of marginal revenue and demand, that value is always getting larger. So I know my markups are going to increase as well. Okay. I might be less likely or inclined to ask you about markups on the final. But if we were to kind of think about why do I know the markup is higher, it's because when I look at higher quantities, that gap in between my demand and twice as steep marginal revenue curve is getting larger and larger, which essentially that gap represents or is related to our markups. Okay. All right. So got 5 minutes left here. Any other questions on this before one more thing I want to mention before we get out of class here. All right, so this is a little bit more out of my morbid curiosity. But what I did here, and it's not worth any points, so this is just you doing me a favor. I might also put kind of what the relationship looks like once I post final grades. I also have statistics courses, which I may kind of use these correlations as examples. But I just put up a little survey here. To get into it, the number is 3,000. And all I'm asking you to answer here is what do you want to see more of you on? So I will still ask the class for questions, right? But if I start to think about things I want to add in or insert more comments about and take more time on, I want to make sure it's matching up with what you guys have questions on. So module 10, that was perfectly competitive. 11 was monopolies. 12 was game theory, which we didn't really do any of today. So maybe if you have questions on that, make sure you're shooting your hand up quickly on Thursday. And then module 13 was monopolistic competitive. So that's module 12, right? That was kind of our game theory section. So it's not worth any points. This is more for me to kind of navigate or direct Thursday's class a little bit. Also, I might look at and report to you guys after the final exam. The correlation was showing up today and Thursday and final exam scores. I'm guessing that correlation is going to be very high. Some of the questions, you might want to listen to me. Some of the questions that we've reviewed today and some things I spent some time on, there is likely a reason I'm doing that. They will likely look very similar to questions you see on the final exam. I will do a very similar thing in Thursday's class. So I can't stress enough how attendance, seeing me review these questions, they're going to look similar to what you see in the final. It's very helpful to be here today and on Thursday. Okay. Other than that, if you have any questions, my emails are getting a little bit backlogged. I'm trying to get back to you as quickly as possible. But office hours tomorrow as kind of normally scheduled. And then I'll see you in class on Thursday for more review. All right.